Thanks for tuning in to the Re-Platform podcast, sponsored by Ampliance and Klaviyo. You're listening to myself, James Gerd, and my co-host, Paul Rogers. How's it going, buddy?
Yeah, good. How are you doing?
Yeah, all right. Nice day. Looking forward to recording another. It seems to come around so quickly, these recording of episodes. It's almost like it's more than one a week. Hello, welcome back to our regular listeners. Thanks for tuning in again, and a warm welcome if you're joining us for the first time. Please do subscribe. We drop a new episode every week, and you'll get alerts on that. And we would love you to like us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, etc. if you find this episode interesting. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about key considerations when switching to a market-leading SaaS e-commerce platform like Shopify or BigCommerce. So let me just tee up what we're going to talk, the key elements, and then I guess Paul can give a bit of clarity on how we're defining SaaS and what we're referring to today. So we're focusing predominantly on Shopify and BigCommerce as they're leading the market in terms of new acquisitions, but we know there are other SaaS platforms out there, Shopware, Elasticpath, etc. There's lots of different SaaS providers in the market. We're focused on where we're seeing most people switching to when they're coming off more legacy platforms. We're going to look at how a SaaS model differs to non-SaaS, and how the boundaries can also be blurred sometimes. For example, big vendors like Salesforce and Adobe, Hybris have their own cloud versions now and hosted. Key benefits of SaaS platforms and like no limitations or common frustrations. So you reckon that's a good enough setup, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that summarizes it well.
So when you change e-commerce vendor model, so we're talking about changing a model, not just changing a platform. So going from something like open source hosted to a cloud native, like multi-tenant SaaS, you're not just swapping out software. It's a slightly different way of working. And that's what we want people to understand the implications, to be able to plan for them, because no platform's perfect, and learning what the compromises are is key. So Paul, can you help people who aren't so au fait with the terminology in the market? How are we defining SaaS, and what are we referring to? What type of platforms today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess SaaS, or software as a service, as you say, is much broader. And there are plenty of kind of SaaS vendors or kind of platforms with a SaaS core. But yeah, we're talking about Shopify and BigCommerce. I think, as you said, these two have to be representing a pretty a big proportion of the market at the moment. It feels like they're both winning a lot of kind of net new customers. And then their approach is quite different, both in terms of the platform itself, kind of the ecosystem and the way some of the other SaaS vendors around the platforms work, and then the agencies as well, which we'll go into.
Yeah, so let's focus first on what makes this type of platform different. So basically, software as a service. Instead of buying a license to get a piece of software that you need to install, or you get a development agency to install for you, either on-premise or through your own hosting, you are paying a license fee to have access to a software that's provided cloud native, and therefore the hosting and the application is all wrapped up into the license fee. And I think this is a key starting point. It's not apples to apples. So say if you had to compare, you've got an existing on-premise Magento, or you've got a development partner who's hosting a version of Magento for you. It's not apples to apples, because the license fee that you're getting from like a Shopify BigCommerce is providing the hosting as well as the application and the software. So important to understand that you can't just directly compare license fees. You have to compare the licensing, the software provision, and the hosting and the support, etc., and then do the comparison that way. What else, Paul, from your experience, makes this type of platform different?
I guess the big one is, the one that we've listed here, that's definitely a very different approach to some of the other platforms in the market, is the upgrade. So sometimes you will have upgrades with SaaS platforms, or forms of upgrades, like the SFRA upgrade with Salesforce and everything else. But with BigCommerce and Shopify, typically these are require minimal input or effort. So Shopify do the odd checkout upgrade, but there's a significant time and cost saving here if you're comparing to a Magento, for example, where realistically you need to allow budget every year for pretty significant version upgrades, and also more minor upgrades, and some of the module upgrades, etc. That's a big part of operating on a Magento or some of the other kind of on-premise platforms. So that's definitely one of the biggest ones. And then I think similarly with things like security patches and any other kind of considerations around security at an application level, and probably not fully, but more so with some of the ways the apps work as well. There's less you need to kind of think about investing, etc. on that side as well.
Yeah, the big upgrades, major releases on the like legacy platforms, even if they are modernising their tech stack and offering like SaaS versions, still catches people out. and it really depends, because one great advantage of an open source solution like Magento is how much you can customise it to your heart's content. The downside with that is if the way that customization has been handled has not been thought through accurately, then the upgrade path to a major upgrade, like now 2.3 to 2.4, can really get people's pants pulled down. I've seen somebody have to swallow a 40 to 50k bill for the upgrade simply because of the way that their installation has been built. So yeah, it's a really, and this is why when cost models are compared, factoring in the upgrades on an annual basis helps you to understand the true cost of ownership. And the other point we were talking about, maybe you can elaborate on this further, is that there are elements where legacy systems would require development to achieve functionality. There might not be an existing plugin. There might be a connector, but actually it requires an element of development to get that connector working for the client to get all the data streams connected. Whereas modern platforms like Shopify and BigCommerce are built around an ecosystem and have a wider range of plug and play apps, a lot of them single click installs.
Yeah, absolutely. And also you have standardized sets of APIs as well that are kind of really well documented that supports anything that might end up requiring more custom development. But yeah, in terms of the apps, so I guess like a good example that I was talking about this morning, so we talked about Harper earlier, which is a concierge service. And we were talking about the integrations with the BigCommerces and the Shopifys and how they can essentially build apps, and they could feasibly provide a really lightweight onboarding service, and there's very little need for kind of technical team members to take on parts and like educate different people that are involved in that integration. Whereas if that was a Magento, there's almost like a mini audit that needs to be done to understand how things have been built, and and how you're using different parts of the platform, and same principle with Salesforce. Things just take longer. There's more room for error. The cost is higher. So yeah, I think that app ecosystem is probably the biggest appeal, I think, for most people with these SaaS platforms. And obviously, as you said, there's definitely cons to some of this stuff as well, and compromise as a result of the platform being a bit more rigid. But to me, I think that's probably like one of the main things that draws people to Shopify and BigCommerce.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we're not trying to paint a golden picture that these platforms solve every business problem and they're perfect for everybody. They aren't. Otherwise, everyone would be on them, and there are pros and cons. So it's really important to take decisions based on merit.
To add to that quickly, I think the other thing is with a Magento or Salesforce, you're far less likely to come up against something that you physically can't do than you are with a potentially Shopify or BigCommerce, particularly around like checkout. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm a fan of platforms for different reasons. And I've seen some very good use cases of Magento with complex product configuration, and also building out custom apps for things like production teams in jewelry production, where they've got very specific data flows needed. So it can work very well depending on the use case. The next thing that is different is having a relationship with the vendor. Now, caveat, this isn't always exclusive to SaaS. There are some big vendors like Salesforce who have always, since they bought out Demandware, provided customer success managers as part of the overall package. But traditionally, the legacy platforms, you don't have the same level of contact with the vendor so much. So let's talk that through, what we mean, and also whether that's a pro or a con, because not everybody wants to have a relationship with the vendor. So what, in your mind, what was the key difference here?
Yeah, so I think Salesforce is probably, all the feedback I've ever had is that is one massive strength for them. Like they're actually kind of, I think they do like QBRs, and they do like strategic sessions to improve different areas of your e-com channel. And I guess they are pretty heavily incentivized as a result.
Yeah, it's a GMV percentage share license fee. So if they help you to get 20% more growth than you plan, then you'll end up paying more. We'll go over. Yeah, exactly. So it adds value, but there is a commercial incentive for them.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that's an area they're particularly strong. Shopify and BigCommerce, I think both of them have got live chat, which can be really useful. There's been plenty of times late at night that I've been on live chat with Shopify trying to figure things out or get an update on an issue or something like that. I think with both of them, you get quite a lot of support through the launch. So you get some level of launch engineer. I know you were talking about that you can also pay for professional services with BigCommerce to get support around kind of architecture and stuff like that. And then with Shopify, you get a dedicated CSM as well, which can be useful if you need it for certain things. So yeah, I don't think everyone uses that to the same level, but it can be useful. So yeah, I think they're good examples.
Yeah, exactly. And this is for a few of the projects I've worked on where we've selected BigCommerce, the added value of being able to tactically bring in a solution engineer through the early phase of the project alongside the SI to help make the right architectural decisions, because as you said, it's a different model, and these platforms don't necessarily have as much core native capability, and you achieve a lot through third-party extensions. That can add complexity if you haven't thought through the right way to integrate it. So sometimes that added level really adds value to the client, and for not a massive amount of spend in the project, sometimes 5 to 10k can get a better architectural setup, which protects the client later on from additional costs. So let's move on to the next one. I guess a key one. Agencies operate slightly differently working on these platforms, and people might be used to a very specific way of working with an agency, and it can take some getting used to a different kind of, I guess, agency culture and approach to work. So could you talk people through some of the ways in which you see agencies operating slightly differently?
Yeah, so I guess this doesn't apply to every agency, because I know there's some agencies that, have a similar approach across lots of different platforms, or they've maybe started life working with one of the more enterprise platforms, and they maybe tend to have a broader offering. But I think typically my experience with some of the agencies in the SaaS space is that they will focus primarily on design and build of the theme, maybe some level of solutions around the app, and then data migration, but they then don't typically take responsibility for the integrations, and they might be they might not be quite as broad or as detailed in the discovery. But I do also think there's some benefit of this. So when I first started working a lot more with Shopify, it took me a long time to get used to this approach, but actually I think quite often with Shopify, you end up with like a broken down, or you just end up with a team of specialists. So like the integration side, you might select a middleware provider, and they might then add on some professional services to properly scope out an integration, and that's all they do. And then to properly build out the piece of middleware with all of the logic that can kind of help to optimize how your data is being passed around and make it easier to bring in different systems in the future, etc. And I think there's been other projects where I've brought in external QA, and I think it might seem like a very different way of working, but I actually think there's quite a lot of pros to it. And typically these agencies have maybe come more from a creative background than a software development background, and I think quite often it will result in the front end piece being stronger as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm with you on it. There are pros and cons to it, and for me, it comes down to the cultural fit. I have a couple of clients where actually that hasn't fitted so well. They find it hard to realise they're going to have to manage multiple third parties to get a project live. Their expectation is, I've got a project manager from an SI, and that is it, and they will manage it all. So I think if people are not culturally in line with that, you have to really educate them. And I do think it seems to change vary a bit between Shopify and BigCommerce. I think some of the BigCommerce agencies I've worked with are much more technically led and are more in tune with doing more detailed discovery and controlling and management, even if they introduce a third party. And I think you're right to pull up on that. Like, you are more likely to have additional third parties, whether you're directly managing that relationship or you're just paying for the service, but the work's being managed by your primary development partner. Good example. A couple of projects I worked on BigCommerce where the recommendation was to go down an integration layer, whether that's a Patchworks or something else, to simplify the data flows and that was managed by the agency rather than the client having to manage the like solution design person from the middleware company.
Yeah.
What is Amplience? In a word, it's freedom. The freedom to build a digital experience as limitless as your vision. Create, preview, schedule, and manage all your content in one easy place. Find out more at amplience.com. Amplience. Experience freedom.
So you talked about the QA thing earlier. I think it'd be useful to elaborate on that for people. So your experience is basically you still need to do QA, of course, because there are code releases and a code release can take a site down, but not as much. What are the reasons why you don't need to pay for as much QA as you would do on a more like traditional legacy platform?
Yeah, I guess there's obviously less that you're testing. So the back end and kind of application side are standardized. So there's far less you need to test on that side. A lot of the third parties you're probably using have pretty standardized integrations. That helps to reduce the amount of testing and equally support on their side. And then you end up with more, I guess you do the same level of integration testing, you do the same level of front-end testing, and then testing around data migration, but that's still quite a lot less than if you're actually having to test all of the kind of back-end functionality and everything else. And then I think also just generally, because there's usually less customization, it just requires maybe slightly less testing in different areas.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the kind of eureka moments people have is like, all right, okay, so I can actually spend more of what I'm used to putting into support and maintenance budget, which involves like the release testing and the project management. I have that more into like actually enhancement work. So I might still spend the same amount of money, but I'm getting more output for it basically rather than keeping the wheels running.
Absolutely.
So we talked about, high level of key differences. Now let's finish up by talking about key pros and cons. So from your point of view, the key reasons that people move and what they enjoy about moving to the likes of Shopify and BigCommerce, what have your clients said to you?
So let's start the pros. So I guess the main thing is a lot of our clients are quite simple. They're simple businesses, they're fashion brands. They might have some complexity around some of the back office stuff or multi-channel stuff, but that's typically handled outside of the SaaS platform. And I guess it just simplifies a lot of the operational side and allows their teams to focus on trading the site and delivering roadmap items and improving the brand experience, etc., or pushing CRM or performance marketing. And I guess that's the main feedback. But equally, there is obviously I don't know if I should talk about it now or later. In fact, cons is later. I'll leave that as my pro.
Yeah, I think from what I've seen with my clients, the main one is that people find the admin systems quite intuitive and easy to use. Like the design feels fresh, more in line with some of the other third-party apps that they're using to achieve functionality, whether that's search and merchandising tools, CMSs, etc. So they like that it doesn't need a degree to figure out, or you don't need a web ops specialist to be able to deal with the back end. And that's been some of the limitations of platforms like what was Demandware and then became Salesforce is functionally quite amazing, but actually it's not always the simplest for a new user to come on board, get into the back end and know how to use it without training. And the fewer bugs, definitely. I think people get surprised. It's like, all right, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. There's no support ticket for that. It's just done, especially with things like the patches and fixes and not worrying about that. So that's just some of the pros. But there are always cons or challenges, however you want to define it. So just semantics. Things aren't always perfect. So what's some of the feedback you've had where people are surprised of, oh, okay, so it doesn't work like this. I'm going to have to put a bit more effort in here, or I wasn't expecting this to be an issue.
I mean, there's some really obvious ones, like I think looking at Shopify and BigCommerce specifically, that kind of multi-store architecture, they're still both working on. That's a big one, I think. But realistically, and we've already talked about it, but the biggest one is they're rigid, and there are things you physically can't do, and that will happen. And that might be the way that you integrate a VMing tool, or it might be, the way that you integrate a subscription provider, or if you want to do multi-shipment in the checkout, whatever else. Like, there are some things that you're just going to have to compromise on. And I think usually that compromise is like teased out in the discovery, and it is compromise. It's not like, people manage it, but that is the thing. Like, if you're a really complex business and you don't want to compromise on some of those areas that are harder to manage, or require more customization, and the platform might not actually be a good fit for you.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is understanding where you can't do something natively or simply without having to extend. So whether you're using BigCommerce's like open SaaS approach, where you build on top of like the APIs, or you build custom apps, same as Shopify private apps, or you build something, a front end like React app to achieve something. For some people, that's really disorientating, because it's like, why doesn't the platform do it? Why do I have to have this? And trying to educate people that it's a different way of working, but you achieve the same thing. I think for me, the number one challenge, and I hammer this home so often, is that people throw out and go, yeah, but Shopify and BigCommerce are cheaper than pick a platform, Magento, Salesforce, whatever it is, because look, our license fees are going to be X, or our development's going to be 50k cheaper. It's like, yes, but that's not your total cost of ownership. And sometimes they are significantly cheaper, but in some use cases where actually the level of complexity you want to achieve would require significant customization, or there's some third-party apps that have chunky license fees. So things like trying to get advanced B2B, Shopify, depending on how far you want to go with multi-storefront and international, or BigCommerce, etc. Whether you need to start adding in things like PIMs, middlewares, then the cost of ownership can be more than you think. And just one tangible example, I'm chatting to a client where they basically comparing Magento and Shopify. They had a lot of complexity around filtered URLs for SEO, like PLP filters. How will we control which of those filters create indexable URLs, which don't? That's something you can set up through logic in Magento relatively easily. Yes, it's a bit of cost in the development phase, but that takes more effort to do that in the likes of Shopify and BigCommerce. So it's not to say you can't achieve it, but sometimes you might have to add some extra SEO costs. So you start adding 2-3k here and there across 4 or 5 elements. You suddenly realize that you're adding a chunk of money. So the most important thing for me is people going in eyes open to this and looking at what the implications are, and looking at what the cost is, and just making a decision on merit.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that with that example you just mentioned as well, some things don't scale as well. So in that example, you can feasibly do that with Shopify, for example, but I've seen people do that with Magento, where they've actually built out different fields in different areas within the admin, so you can like inject custom metadata, or inject content, or like change controls at different levels. And I think that is the thing. Like, some levels of complexity will be really tricky to manage from a back-end perspective, especially.
Yeah, and people often talk about agility with SaaS. So you're agile because you all of the application upgrades are going on in the background. That's what you're paying for. It's quicker to plug and play with apps and change things in and out. They've got really good, effective APIs, etc. But then you've got flexibility, and the two are different but related. And a platform like a Magento, or other open source platforms like Woo, for example, or even the new composable ones, Elastic's commerce tools, they give you the greatest flexibility. And there's a trade-off between agility and flexibility. And there's costs involved in it. And this is the joy. The other one that related to the third-party apps, and I have seen it, and this is not a criticism of the SaaS platforms, but it's an observation about how people use them, is I've found that some people, they make quicker decisions about which apps to use, because it's so easy to just turn one on or do some basic configuration. And that sometimes means they don't think through, from a selection point of view, which one's the best fit. And then they often have to go back and redo it later, take it out, put another one in. And that might mean loss of data, or it might mean a bit of additional development work with the agency. And that's an opportunity cost. So I'm finding that sometimes people make decisions quicker. So that agility comes at a cost if you haven't thought through the decision properly. So again, it's not an issue of the platform. It's more about how people use the platform.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that one.
Anything else you found in terms of challenges or delights that people have when making a switch?
I don't think so. I think, like we've said, basically, there's pros and cons. I mean, I feel like my average client's probably ended up being quite suited to the SaaS, these two platforms in particular. But I do also think, I've worked with plenty of businesses, and I know you've worked with some really complex businesses that probably aren't as well suited. So yeah, it's that same thing. We always end up at this point at the end of an episode where we end up saying the same thing, which is like balancing and pulling out the business objectives and everything else. But yeah, I think there's definitely some pros, but as we've said, there are cons as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. The great thing about the modern SaaS platforms is typically you can get quicker development times, and the caveat, as we said, is really complex businesses. That's when these business cases become far harder, because then you end up with a lot of sticky plaster and bolt-ons and integrate, and that can take away that efficiency and add time and effort elsewhere. But actually, for more simple like brand direct to consumer, only a few storefronts, not an overly complex international setup, a lot of these businesses, the cost and speed of development to get live is far quicker and lower. And I've seen projects where you can save 30 to 40K and you could be live in 3 to 4 months versus maybe 6 to 7. So I think there is definitely for a certain type of business a speed and cost benefit that's undeniable in these platforms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, so that's our whistle stop tour of modern SaaS and what it is and where we see the pros and some of the challenges. We hope it's been useful. We'd love you to challenge us. Is there anything you don't agree with or really key points you think we've missed out? Let us know. We'd love to hear about them. We don't think we got the monopoly on right answers here. But thanks for listening. Keep an ear open for the next episode. As you say, they land every week. If you haven't subscribed, do so. You'll get alerts when new episodes drop. And we'd love a rating on Apple, Spotify or YouTube. Thanks very much. Take care.
For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.